Good morning and welcome to Explorers Forum on Sunday, January 31st, when Sue Linderman will present the fourth program in the series entitled Racism in America, the History We Didn't Learn in School. Let's open in prayer. Jesus Christ, Son of God, who promised in your first sermon to break the chains of the oppressed and to set the prisoners free, break apart our wrecked and ruinous criminal justice or injustice system. Grant hope and strength to those who are in prison, those who have been released from prison, and the families that miss them and welcome them. We pray also for our elected officials that they might seek a more just and humane approach to imprisonment and rehabilitation. And grant us courage and compassion as we seek to end the injustice that keeps people from living full and productive lives. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Sue, thank you for leading us today.
Well, good morning. I am Sue Linderman, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to share this time with you as we continue our exploration of racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. This is focused today on part 4 of 6, mass incarceration and the war on drugs. As we've seen in the history described in these last 3 weeks, the relationship between African Americans and our country's justice systems, both legal and extra-legal, has been one of violence and oppression. The impunity with which these acts have been carried out echoes loudly in our current circumstances. So today we will focus on the period following the landmark civil rights movement to observe the backlash that occurred and see how the combination of power and bigotry shapes today's criminal justice system. We are focused on gaining more truth as hopefully a basis for a truth and reconciliation process that our country desperately needs. So let's continue. A brief recap from last week. We covered the early 20th century, focusing on the significant degree of housing segregation in the United States and the role played by the Federal Housing Administration, the Veterans Administration, and in fact, private real estate agents as well. We looked at discrimination in public policy, specifically the Social Security Act and the GI Bill. We considered the ongoing impact of the Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson, establishing separate but equal as the law of the land, and the impact of the Brown v. Board of Education decision and the massive resistance to that decision, all leading to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s that culminated in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There are images that I would not have shown giving this class in earlier weeks and months, but they are images that reflect circumstances that separate Blacks and whites in our society. So while there are numerous factors that led to the horrific assault on our Capitol on January 6th, there is a racial dimension that is unmistakable, yet one more consequence of our country's history. So if we look at the issue of mass incarceration, I would propose that there have been 3 phases. The first, of course, and the most significant, was the 225 years where the institution of slavery was in effect, and every aspect of lives of the slaves was controlled. Phase 2 was part of the evolution that Brian Stevenson describes, the evolution to slavery by another name, in the form of convict leasing, which was officially in effect between 1846 and 1928, but continued beyond that point, and in fact, to some degree, continues even today as we look at our prison system. But we're going to focus this morning on what I would call phase 3, mass incarceration and the war on drugs that began in 1972. If we look at mass incarceration today, the United States is home to less than 5% of the world's population, but we have more than 25% of the world's inmates. In 1972, there were 200,000 people incarcerated in America. By 2017, there was an order of magnitude increase in that number to more than 2.3 million. Today, there are more than 7 million people either incarcerated or on parole or probation in America. And this series of actions and developments has had a disproportionate impact on people of color. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. Imagine if Germany today were to have that level of imprisonment of its Jewish population. And importantly, it is legal to discriminate against criminals in ways that we have observed in historical discrimination against African Americans. Our system allows discrimination in employment, in housing, in the right to vote, in educational opportunity, in access to food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service. So while many of these discriminatory practices have existed in the past, today it is legal for that level of discrimination against those who have been convicted of a crime. So what does our incarceration look like? These are numbers from 2010. For every 100,000 people in the population, there are 380 white people incarcerated, 966 per 100,000 Latino, and 2,207 Black Americans. Now there's going to be a test on this graph, so I want you all to memorize it. It's going to be very important. It is a reflection of the 2.3 million people in jail or prison in the United States. 909,000 of those are incarcerated for violent offenses. 450,000 are imprisoned for drug offenses. And amazingly, 530,000 of those people are in jail awaiting trial. Not only have they not been found guilty, they haven't even had a trial. More than 500,000 people. So how did we get here? The major factor that we're going to discuss today is the war on drugs, which President Nixon declared in 1971. Nixon famously divided the world into friends and enemies. In fact, there were those who considered a badge of honor to be listed on Nixon's enemies list at the time. But subsequent to his administration, one of his close advisors, John Ehrlichman, reported that Nixon saw that his two primary enemies were the anti-war left and Blacks. And so he utilized the war on drugs to address those two groups of enemies. In fact, during the Nixon administration, marijuana was made a Schedule I drug, along with LSD and heroin. And so the penalties for marijuana use mirrored those of the other two drugs. During Nixon's administration, they dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies, introduced mandatory sentencing, and no-knock warrants, about which we'll learn a great deal more in a few minutes. When Reagan took office, he expanded the war on drugs. And this was also a period of time when we saw the emergence of political dog whistles. Dog whistles are phrases that on the surface have a benign meaning, but have a very particular meaning to the audience to which they are targeted. Lee Atwater was a prominent Republican consultant and operative during this period of time. And in 1981, he was recorded saying, you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is that Blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. So this process of dog whistles was adopted with alacrity by President Reagan, who is famously quoted as talking frequently about a Chicago welfare queen with 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, collecting veterans benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. She's got Medicaid, she's getting food stamps, collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $100,000. Often in describing this woman, he would picture her tooling around behind the wheel of a Cadillac. And beyond propagating that image of Blacks, he would focus on the image of whites as the workers, the taxpayers, the persons playing by the rules and struggling to make ends meet, while brazen minorities partied with their hard-earned tax dollars. He famously described the strapping young buck standing ahead of you in the grocery store line buying a T-bone steak while you could only afford hamburger. And so these messages permeated throughout the political scene at the time and made the ability to utilize the war on drugs to even more detrimental effect. Between the period of 1980 and 1997, imprisonment for nonviolent drug crimes increased from 50,000 to 400,000. And in 1985, the issue of crack cocaine surfaced. And it showed up in the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which differentiated between powder and crack cocaine. Now, pharmacologically, there is no difference between the two. But crack cocaine is significantly cheaper than powder and was the cocaine of choice for poorer people, often disproportionately African American. And so this act introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. And when it was modified in 1988, it said that the same 5 to 10 year mandatory minimum sentences would apply for the possession or distribution of 5 grams of crack, but it would take 500 grams of powder cocaine for the same sentence, mandatory sentence, to be imposed. I want to take a minute and talk about Stone Mountain. Stone Mountain took prominence in the South in 1915 when the Ku Klux Klan recreated itself, having been quiescent for a number of years following Reconstruction. The Klan held regular events there, and in 1920 began fundraising with the United Daughters of the Confederacy to raise the money to create the bas-relief sculpture that still exists there today at Stone Mountain. It shows Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee astride charging stallions. Stone Mountain was the site of the Ku Klux Klan's annual Labor Day cross burning, and these rallies persisted until 1991. So in 1992, Bill Clinton is running for president. He's pretty confident of Democratic support, African-American support, but he's feeling the need to shore up support from white Americans. So a few days before Super Tuesday, he holds an event at Stone Mountain. And he is there with 3 prominent conservative Southern Democrats. And he speaks about the need to get tough on crime. The backdrop are inmates from the penal institution there at Stone Mountain, overwhelmingly Black, and the message is clear. And so for the first time, Democrats have absorbed and utilized the get tough on crime message that had been the hallmark of the Nixon and Reagan administrations. And in 1994, Congress passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, the famous 3 strikes, you're out law. 3 often nonviolent felony convictions, and your sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole. That law also introduced 60 new death penalty offenses and provided $10 billion in funding for state prisons and $11 billion in funding for state and local police. Now, as all this was going on, there was the bubbling up of some opposition to the racial inequities in the laws. And the US Sentencing Commission was established to determine whether or not the sentencing disparities between the crack and cocaine usage was appropriate or should be changed. And so in 1995, the US Sentencing Commission issued a report recommending that that disparity be reduced, but Congress overrode the recommendation, and it continued in effect until finally in 2010, with the Fair Sentencing Act, that 100-to-1 disparity was reduced to 18-to-1. So if you're going to have this war on drugs, how are you going to make it work? Because the federal government isn't going to be out on the streets arresting people for drug crimes. So they needed to enlist the aid of state and local law enforcement agencies. And they began in 1982 by issuing federal cash grants to state and local law enforcement agencies to make enforcement of drug laws a priority. Instead of doing that other stuff you've been doing, let's focus on enforcing the drug laws that exist. And then in 1984, a hugely significant thing happened that I knew nothing about until this research surfaced. There is a federal civil asset forfeiture law. Civil asset forfeiture says that officers and agents may lawfully seize the property or money of individuals that they suspect of committing or helping to commit a crime. And those assets are seized and retained regardless of whether charges are ever brought, let alone whether they are ever proved and a conviction results. And these assets don't just need to belong to the person suspected of committing the crime, but it can be of a family member or a neighbor or someone in some way associated with that individual. And so a series of events occurred that expanded the civil asset forfeiture law so that money and securities and real property could be seized by the government. And this law in 1984 said that the federal law enforcement agencies would retain these proceeds to be used exclusively for law enforcement. So rather than using all this funding for other beneficial purposes, the funds were to be retained for use by law enforcement. And it created the opportunity for equitable sharing programs between state and local governments and the federal government. This would allow the bypassing of state laws that were often more stringent in terms of how these funds would be used. So this expanded law said that funds could be used for law enforcement equipment, weapons, salaries and overtime, training, travel expenses, informant reward money, and detention facilities. The money was used for burn grants for states to set up narcotics task forces. In the 90s, this money was used for cash grants that would be issued to state and local law enforcement agencies based on the number of drug arrests that they made. And significantly, in the period from 1997 to 1999, it resulted in 3.4 million orders of Pentagon equipment being delivered to state and local law enforcement agencies. In 1986, that fund totaled $93.7 million. By 2013, after all those expenditures that I've described, the balance in the Civil Asset Forfeiture Fund was $4.2 billion. And the collateral damage has been huge. First of all, there has been an extraordinary assault on the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." Well, in 1968, there was a Supreme Court opinion issued in Terry v. Ohio, where the court substantially expanded the police power to search and seize, limiting the right to privacy of individuals. It said that warrantless search could be executed on the basis of suspicious behavior as a preventive measure. And the court affirmed that police officers could interrogate and frisk suspicious individuals without probable cause. That decision was used to target African Americans for wearing flat brim hats or hooded sweatshirts. A subsequent decision in 1996, Wren v. United States, further controlled the privacy rights of individuals against warrantless searches and seizures by allowing law enforcement the ability to stop a person in a motor vehicle based on a pretext, like a broken taillight or an illegal lane change. And we see the consequences of that assault on the Fourth Amendment everywhere. We've also observed that there is a racial bias in stop and frisk. New York City was particularly known for this in the earlier days, but it is true everywhere. And all of this created a significant disruption of social relationships, particularly in the African American community, as more and more Black, particularly men, were stopped, arrested, incarcerated. All of this action has resulted in the militarization of the police, encouraged the use of excessive force, and clearly eroded any trust in the stated intention of police forces to protect and serve. And so, part of what we have seen as a consequence of all of this is an explosion in the number of life sentences without parole. That sentence quadrupled in the period since 1984. More than half of these sentences have been imposed on people who have committed no violent crime. So 3 non-violent felonies, and your sentence is life in prison without parole. A further consequence of that is if you are sentenced to death, if your sentence is the death penalty in the United States, you are entitled to significant levels of legal representation to appeal your sentence and hopefully to make certain that it was appropriately applied and that the only executions are carried out on the truly guilty, which is the subject of a whole nother set of discussions. But if you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, there are no resources available to you to challenge that sentence. And so the impact on poor people and people of color is dramatically increased. And so often even juveniles have been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and are likely to die in jail. And it, of course, raises the question of the possibility of redemption, of rehabilitation, all of which are inconsequential when it comes to this particular sentence being imposed. Mass incarceration today is further fed by the system of probation and parole that exists in the country. There are now more than 7 million people in the United States under the control of the correction system. The 2.3 million who are incarcerated, 3.7 million on probation, and almost 1 million on parole. In fact, in the state of Delaware, 75% of those on probation or parole will be reincarcerated within 3 years, often because of violations that do not even constitute commission of another crime. So one of the aspects of all of this, as the prison population grew from 200,000 to 2.3 million, is where to put all these people. Initially, there was some space in prisons that people could be incarcerated, and you could put 2 people in a cell where there used to be 1, but eventually the ability of states to incarcerate that number of people was exhausted. And so capitalism to the rescue, we see the establishment of private for-profit prisons. In 1998, there were 5. By 2008, there were 100. And during that time period, the profits in those prisons increased by more than 500%. Now, if you are operating a prison for profit, your shareholders are, of course, most interested in the bottom line. So any dollars that you might be inclined to spend on rehabilitation in preparing these prisoners to re-enter society are going to have a negative effect on your performance rating in the present. And so you ask yourself, how much money do you want to spend on rehabilitation given that circumstance? And further, and it's difficult not to be overwhelmingly cynical, if you rehabilitate these people so that they are successful when they return to society, then they're likely not to show up back again as one of your guests. We also look at the impact of cash bail and fines and fees. We talked about the number of people in jail in the United States awaiting trial. Some of them are being held because the crimes were violent and they are a danger to society, and bail should not be granted. But in the majority of those cases, bail has been set and people cannot afford to pay the bail. And so they sit in jail waiting for their trial to be scheduled. And that often takes more than a year. And so the impact on their families and their communities is enormous. The statistics in Delaware show that 25% of the people in jail in Delaware are awaiting trial. And 40% of the women in jail in Delaware are awaiting trial. When it comes to fines and fees, there's a significant initiative underway to look at this issue in Delaware. But the current law is if you have been assessed fines or fees as the result of a crime, and you fall behind in the payment of those dollars, a warrant can be issued for your arrest. Now, you may or may not actually be arrested. Seldom is it a case that the police go out looking for you based on the warrant that's been issued. But should you be stopped for some reason, then the effect of the warrant takes effect. And one of the parameters of that warrant being issued is that your driver's license is suspended. So you can't afford to pay your fines or your fees, and a warrant is issued and your driver's license is invalid. And how exactly are you to get to work? And if you're stopped and it's found that your license is suspended, then more fines and fees are going to be added to the burden that you carry. So today's criminal justice system is characterized by this significant erosion of Fourth Amendment rights that at some level affects or potentially affects all of us. It is clear that our criminal justice system is racialized at every stage from beginning to end. A higher proportion of Blacks and brown people are stopped by police. Of those stops, a higher proportion are arrested. Of those arrests, more charges are filed, and the charges are more severe. The conditions of bail are higher. Access to legal representation is harder. It has been truthfully, accurately said that it is better to be rich and guilty in America than poor and innocent. The opportunities for plea bargains versus the threat of trial more significantly impact the poorer people and people of color. Sentences are more severe and appeals more difficult to manage, to access. In fact, in 2015 or 16, a judge in Massachusetts observed that Blacks and Latinos who were sent to prison in that state received longer sentences than their white counterparts sentenced for similar crimes. And he wanted to know why. So Harvard University was commissioned to undertake a study to answer that question. It was a 4-year study that ended at the end of 2020, and Harvard's report was issued. They reviewed more than 1 million cases in the state of Massachusetts. They found that 665 of every 100,000 Blacks were incarcerated versus 82 of every 100,000 whites. While Black and brown citizens are 24% of the population, they are subject to 63% of the stop and frisk and searches. A higher proportion are detained without bail, and bail is routinely set higher. When charged, the offenses are more severe, and they are more likely to be referred to Superior Court, where the potential consequences are greater. And the average sentence is 168 days longer for the same crime. So this is not just hyperbole, this is not just history, this is not just rumor. And certainly what was studied and concluded in Massachusetts, we know is taking place in other states as well. So the criminal justice system in our country is in desperate need of reform at every level, federal, state, and local. Action is underway, but so much more is needed. You may know that in the Delaware legislative session of 2019, a combination of organizations supported by the Delaware Attorney General's office submitted 19 pieces of legislation for consideration to the legislature. 11 of those 19 were enacted. Now they were the more peripheral, the less consequential of the acts that were proposed, but nevertheless, it showed forward progress in criminal justice reform that was hopeful. Not a great deal was accomplished in the 2020 session, in part because of the pandemic and the fact that the legislature did not meet in person. But they are back in session now, and there have been some changes in representation in the Delaware State Legislature that offer some hope that initiatives presented and encouraged by Smart Justice Delaware, the ACLU, supported by the Attorney General's office, may indeed be enacted. And so what is important for us as residents of Delaware, as citizens of the United States, is to become aware of these initiatives. What is being proposed, and how do we make our voices heard? For those of us who live in Delaware, one of the advantages of a small state is that perhaps our voices can be a little louder. I may have mentioned to this group that at the time, Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, Leo Strine, and Justice C.J. Seitz gave a presentation on racism in the Delaware justice system at Westminster Church. And one of the things that they pointed out is that in Delaware, if you are a legislator, if you hear from a couple dozen people on an issue, that's a lot. If you hear from hundreds, let alone thousands, it's an overwhelming sound that it is difficult for you to ignore. So to the extent to which we can engage and involve ourselves with these organizations and these initiatives that seek to rectify some of these horrific wrongs in our criminal justice system, we will have an effect and we can make a difference.
Thank you, Sue. Do people have questions or comments that you would like to make? It's a lot of information, I know.
Terry?
Yes, I have two comments. First, when you, Sue, when you mentioned that it was in the 80s that the welfare queen became prominent, and that is accurate. I mean, that's my knowledge as well, but I can tell you that in small towns in the Midwest, when I was a college student, and that's between the late 50s and the early 60s, that same point of view of a welfare queen, and they were our tax dollars, and this was back in the day when every child, it was the, I forget the phrase, I used to have it in my head, you got money for every child in your house if you were in poverty. So these children born to the poor because they didn't have birth control, in my living room as I grew up, and in the attitude was, look at all these people making living off our tax dollars because they have more babies. And when you gave the reality, which I learned in college, that they could barely survive with the money they were given, that never seemed to have an effect. It was terrible, terrible, terrible attitude. My father used to try to ameliorate some of the attitudes that were coming from the mouths of others in his living room by saying, well, people have to live, children have to eat once they're born, and tried to justify some of that. But the attitude was horrid, absolutely horrid, and still is. Then the second comment I have is at your public library in Newcastle County, is this put out by the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, Alabama, is a calendar. And I looked yesterday at the first 3 months and read the write-up on every date. And every date in the first 3 months, and it goes for 365 days, there is, if you go over the years of our country since the coming of the Europeans, there is discrimination either against Native Americans. There is an overt act of discrimination or attack on either Native Americans or
Tell them where to get it.
Or blacks out of your Newcastle library. You can get them as many as you want.
Free.
Free, they're free. Newcastle County Library is providing these. And I got 5, and I have 2 or 3 neighbors here in the neighborhood that are going to be the beneficiaries of this. It's by the Equal Justice Initiative. Those are my 2 comments. But Sue, thank you for your wonderful, consistent, thorough giving of this information, which is needed throughout our nation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The issue you speak of locally, Lyle, that issue of welfare and the unfairness with the racial overlay to it has existed since the creation of the welfare system and before. The 80s was the first time a president of the United States articulated it in such draconian and exaggerated terms that brought it to a prominence that it had not had before. And that calendar is wonderful. I have one, it's on my window seat, and every morning I go down and I look at what the event of the day is. And actually you can get copies and put them on your literature table at church or whatever to make it available to people, but it's full of just incredible historical information. Thank you, Lyle.
Sarah, and then Noble has comments. So Sarah.
So thank you, Sue. Again, I learned a lot today as usual, but I just wanted to add something related that I had learned in a class that I took at the University of Delaware this past fall. It was about a course on families and family theories of family development. And one of the articles we read was about women who are coming back out of prison. And women, according to this article, women coming out of prison are expected to obtain and keep a full-time job, obtain their own housing, while at the same time they're trying to come back into society. Many of them have children. They're trying to reestablish relationships with their children. They're trying to repair relationships at the same time. So they've got all of this going on. Most of them are unskilled. So the jobs that they could potentially get are minimum wage jobs that aren't terribly inspiring. And many of them have been in jail for drug crimes. So it's not surprising that they could have a very difficult time managing all of that and could, in fact, turn back to drugs as a way to deal with mental health issues, which is not to assume that they would, but I just was struck by how impossible a task that seemed and what a setup it seemed like.
Exactly. And when you overlay a system of probation on top of that, where you are required to keep the government informed of your address, perhaps you're having trouble finding stable housing, you're needing to stay with friends, you're needing to move, and perhaps the first thing that you think of when faced with that circumstance is not letting the state know, that's a violation of your probation. And typically probation violations result in immediate incarceration, reincarceration, while the government figures out whether in fact you have done something that warranted that reincarceration. The fact that you're to check in with a probation officer when you struggle for transportation, the issues that people confront can be just overwhelming in that situation. And so yet another thing for people like us to engage in is looking for reentry programs that help returning citizens find stability and manage the challenges that exist in reestablishing themselves in the community. There's there are a significant number of organizations doing that, and they are in need of mentors. They're in need of volunteers to help in that process. So it is yet something else that we can do to make a difference.
Thank you for that, Sue and Sarah. Noble, and then Tracy.
My brother Charles has a trucking business, and 4 years ago, we've been in Delaware for 4 years, he told me he was extremely busy at one period. He was hauling these concrete prefab modules on his trailer. He wasn't sure at first what it was. He discovered what he was doing was hauling these modules for private prisons. These were prefab prison cells. The demand was so great that they were working around the clock to erect these prisons. Also about the same time in Pennsylvania, there was a spate of increase in a number of children, young men, teenagers, who are being incarcerated for minor charges. And it was investigated and found out that many of these kids, if not most of these kids, were going before one judge. This judge was incarcerating these kids for almost nothing. It was discovered that he was a shareholder in one of these prisons. And the more kids he incarcerated, the more money he earned. Down the street from where Patrick and I lived before we moved to Delaware, was a man, lovely man. And we discovered that he had been a parole officer one time. He had parlayed that experience into a very, very lucrative private prison ownership for himself and his families. And they had made millions of dollars on this endeavor. And so, and he was investigated several times for this. So I'm thrilled that one of the things that President Biden has done is to not renew the contracts for these private prisons. I don't know how long the contracts go. Are they for 5 years or 10 years or maybe 1 or 2 years? But I'm hoping that our friends in Pennsylvania with this lucrative private prison endeavor soon will be out of business.
And Noble, there's another aspect to this private prison business. You know, Delaware is proud not to have any for-profit prisons. But then when the prisons get overcrowded, they ship prisoners to other states, which means that their families can't visit them, they can't see their kids, you know, so it's not like this is a walk in the park, not having for-profit prison. It's part of the whole issue with the system.
Tracy?
Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Keenan. I'm the missional presbyter at Newcastle Presbyterian. Sue, I just want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. This is the kind of thing that we really want to get into every church. The hard part from where I sit is not, I mean, this information, even to those of us who think we are fairly well informed about situations, I always learn things that are just eye openers. But from where I sit, there are so many churches. My hard time comes from convincing churches that they need to learn this stuff, that there's more than they think behind the decisions that they see and what they think of as information that comes their way. So I just want to thank you, and I want to tell you that I'm, you know, doubly, triply, whatever, committed to trying to get this into many more of our churches. I think that's the eye-opening capacity of all of this information can't help but translate into how we do and be church. So thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm going to be doing a class with Concord Presbyterian starting in February, and I'm doing a class with St. Philip's, St. Stephen's, and Good Shepherd Lutheran churches. So I think word of mouth is spreading a little bit, and I suspect that helps as well.
We'll have one more question from Larry Peterson. Oh, sorry, and Judy has one too. So we'll do Larry and then Judy, and then we'll end there.
Mine is not a question, it's sharing an observation. Until last month, for the last probably 10 years, I've been in an organization that we invited various people to come in and speak. And we invited several organizations that try to work with prisoners in Delaware, adjust and get some skills to find better quality jobs once they leave prison. But one of the things I learned, Sue just mentioned that we don't have private prisons, but we do have private contracts for the medical needs in Delaware prisons. And so to save money, prisoners are not getting medication they need. They're not getting medical services that they need. And that was documented on multiple sources. There is one group in Sussex County that the News Journal about a year ago did a whole feature on, and we heard lots of wonderful things about this group. It works with men, but it takes them out and actually teaches them skills so that they are good candidates for work. But we heard again and again what Sue was talking about, the lack of transportation. And at one point we had Governor Minner visit us at Hanover Presbyterian, and one man in the congregation told her he was falsely imprisoned, a white man here in Delaware. And he told her about what he had found, that they were not serving any heated meals at all. Everything they ate was cold, and went on with various abuses. And her response was, oh, well, you need to go talk to the commissioner that's in charge of the prisoners. And he told her, we already have. And so it was like nobody was interested in doing anything. So I also want to get in line to thank Sue for all that she's brought to us.
Yeah, because even if prisons aren't operating for a profit, they're operating under a budget. And there's pressure on cost savings for sure.
Thank you. And so Judy and Jesse.
It was Judy. Sue, thank you so much. This was really informative. I was wondering though, I had heard that with the COVID, there were more releases being made of the minor, people serving more minor offenses. And I just wondered, did we do that in Delaware? Do you know? I'm just curious.
I'm not up on the current status, maybe someone else is. I know there have been initiatives to do that, and I believe there was some limited action taken, but I believe that the full proposal has not been implemented, and it would have had a much more favorable impact on the effect on these prisoners of the spread of the virus. Maybe somebody else knows the current status. My information is about a month old, which makes it probably completely obsolete.
Shannon raised her hand, so she may know.
I just know a lot about COVID releases. And if you are interested in learning more, any person or any organization learning more about how reform efforts are being undertaken in at least the federal justice system, I'm happy to speak to those at any time. In addition to abuses, there are people inside and outside the system, and there have been for many years, who are working diligently. And so to the extent that that is its own course, I am more than happy to assist if anybody's interested. But with respect to COVID, there have been fewer folks brought into the system, if that makes any sense. Yep. So that's the answer.
Okay, thanks.
There is an initiative to have those individuals released. I signed a petition for it with, I think it's, you mentioned the name of one group, something
Smart Justice Delaware.
Yes. So anyway, so there is an effort, but I don't know if it's happened yet, Judy.
Thanks.
Sue, thank you again for teaching us and raising our awareness. And now let's all think about what our own individual and collective next steps are going to be. And one thing we can do is join in next week when we have session 5 of our series. So everybody have a good week. Stay safe and warm, whatever the weather brings.
Go sledding.
If you haven't listened to Sam's sermon today, listen to it. I know you can. I know you can. Thank you.
Thank you. And everybody have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.